On September 18, 2001, President George W. Bush signed into law the Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF, which gave the president the authority needed to respond to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, effectively beginning the War on Terror. 2 months later, President Bush issued a military order that allowed for the Secretary of Defense to detain suspected terrorists at a facility in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and to try them via military tribunal, more commonly known as Gitmo, which started as a facility to temporarily hold suspected terrorists until they could receive public trials, has become a long-term detention facility filled with individuals who have not been charged with any crimes. Over the years, Gitmo has been the source of physical, mental, and sexual abuse allegations, and today Gitmo houses 40 detainees, some having been there for almost 2 decades, and serves as a recruiting tool for a number of Islamic extremist groups in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central and Southeast Asia. Welcome to the Boardwalk.
All right, welcome back to the Boardwalk. We hope you guys have been subscribing and sharing this with people. We like making this for you guys, so we just hope people listen to it, which, according to our stats, not many do. So maybe one day. Hey, so today, as the intro would suggest, we're talking about Guantanamo Bay detention camp. So, basically, that started this whole idea of detaining people. Like we talked about in the intro, kind of started with the kickoff of the War on Terror and indefinite detention without trial, and accusations of torture. Obviously, this isn't taking place on United States soil. So, but during Obama's administration, I guess, guys, the number, at least according to this Wikipedia article, was reduced from 245 prisoners to about 41 people there. So what's the cost of keeping 41 people at Guantanamo? Zach, I think you had it earlier.
$13 million per detainee.
That's a reasonable amount of money, isn't it? So, I mean, this has basically been going on in Cuba for, I guess, 20 years now, and with just 40 people left. So, it's kind of outlived its purpose. Biden has declared he wants to shut down the facility, but Obama also declared he was going to shut it down and met bipartisan opposition to that. And I think that bipartisan opposition just comes from people playing politics. They don't want these accused terrorists being held in their state, so they all vote to keep it open. So, but of course, as we'll discuss, not many of these people, or some of these people, are not really terrorists at all. Maybe they're just held there on suspicion. So,
yeah, but especially in post 9/11 America, especially for the Republicans, you couldn't be the guy that's tough on terrorism and then end up housing a Guantanamo inmate who suddenly has the opportunity to see a judge and get his case heard and maybe get released, because sure as hell, the next Republican or Democrat in some cases would swoop in and say, "Hey, I'm tough on the terrorists," and move in and try to take your spot. And that's probably something a lot of them were concerned with.
I always thought that the argument or the rationale that this was always met with, like you said, Kyle, bipartisan disapproval of the idea that President Obama had to close down Guantanamo, and now President Biden has that same idea. In between them, Donald Trump signed an executive order saying that it was going to stay open, and his exact words, "We're going to fill it up with bad dudes."
Is that a quote? Really? Is that what he said?
That is a direct quote. "We're going to fill it up with bad dudes."
Wow. So rather than turn these bad dudes over to their home country's, justice system, which is probably inept and corrupt, but at least it would be autonomous of that nation. Mm-hmm. We're just going to capture people and stick them in Gitmo, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, without trials. Yeah, Trump would be a great hype man for like a 90s cartoon or 80s cartoon. Just, are you bad enough to take these guys on? Real bad dudes.
Oh, I could talk on and on about his lack of intellect, but we'll stay on topic. When I was doing the research leading up to this episode, which we thought we were going to do last week, and then plans changed, and we had some fun talking about crazy generals. looking at Guantanamo and just so we've had the base for over 100 years. Back before Cuba was how we see Cuba now. We pay them like $4,000 a year to lease out that property, which is that's a pretty good deal, I guess. Um, but looking at when President Obama said that we were going to leave Guantanamo, right? What amazes me isn't so much the bipartisan pushback because that was still at the height of both wars. I'm not overly shocked that in 2009 the Democratic senators from the blue states still didn't want to do it, but I was surprised that by the end of his second term they were still in that position because like I went through and I read George Bush's military order, and it says they're going to be tried by military commission. Right? That's as close to a standard military court martial as you're going to get. So we've decided the venue. It's in the military court system. So how about you just transfer to a military correction or a military jail? Like what was
Right.
so fucking hard about that?
Yeah.
And that saves
Yeah.
us literally billions of dollars.
Right. I mean, they could have transferred to Leavenworth or somewhere, but at the same time, like, I mean, what are the implications? And I'm not a lawyer. I mean, what are the implications of trying somebody by U.S. military tribunal? That's not a member of the U.S. military, essentially. I mean, I guess like Nuremberg or whatever kind of
Well,
goes
did
back
you
to that.
see I did some, we all did some reading up, and I saw that I guess Colin Powell he suggested a Nuremberg style public trial, which I think that's a pretty reasonable way to go about doing this. And that was one of the more common suggestions. There were a lot of people just said keep it in line with the Geneva Conventions, which this has to be. These are enemy combatants. They're not part of a nation, but they are enemy combatants. So I was okay with whether it be a military tribunal or a Nuremberg style trial. I don't have an issue with either of those. They both fall within the realm of what is legally acceptable. What's not legally acceptable, even though our government's been saying it for 20 years now, is that they can just indefinitely hold people and not try them. Like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is the alleged mastermind behind 9/11. I don't say alleged because I think he's innocent. I say alleged because he hasn't been tried yet. And he's been there for like 17 fucking years. Like his trial is supposed to finally start this year in New York City in a civilian court. This is
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, he should have been tried. If we have the evidence, try him when we capture him. Just don't keep him there. Don't hold him. Don't. There's really no point in it. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know what was the
But if
delay.
if we're not holding him semi secretly, then we can't abuse him.
That's a whole different
Which I'm
conversation, right?
sure
Well,
the
we'll
CIA.
tie that into this one, I'm sure.
Yeah, it'll
Oh yeah.
have to be tied in. Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
that's the whole point. Is it's kind of outside the jurisdiction of, like, I don't know, decent. Well, I'd say human decency, but just outside of the oversight of law.
What one of the
Well,
what
I mean the entire idea of like what international law is supposed to be, like post World War II, where the U.S. is essentially trying to be like this shining beacon of what a country is supposed to be, and we're trying to link in all of our allies and say, hey, let's have like actual justice in the world, and then we're pulling this essentially like a CIA black site out there for the world to criticize. It's been a black eye for the U.S. for decades now. It's like,
and that's on top of the literal dozens of CIA black sites that we were running up until halfway through the Obama administration.
As if we're not running
Until
them now, or we
yeah, the ones we know
subcontract them
about.
out
Yeah,
to, or we
we
subcontract them out
acknowledged
to other countries.
we acknowledged the ones in like Poland and like Southeast Asia, and then we acknowledged that those don't exist anymore. That doesn't mean there's not a new one in Poland or a different part of Southeast Asia for sure. But
Or
yeah, I
just
mean that's
yeah,
so we went from having these CIA black sites, which everybody, even if they weren't made public, we all had an idea of, they're pulling these guys up in Afghanistan. They're going somewhere before they get to Cuba, right? Like I
yeah,
don't think any of us are surprised with that. But what really gets me, and the reason why this is such a big issue with me, is I'm very much a proceduralist. Like the day will come when we're not talking about Afghanistan and we might talk about current events. I'm very, procedure matters, and adhering to the rules set in place matters. And the best I can tell, nothing about Guantanamo is within the rules. If they're subject to a military commission that is a military trial, okay, there's been Supreme Court decision after Supreme Court decision that says these detainees, they're going to go through our justice system, whether it's in the military courts or the civilian courts. It's pretty plain as day that they are then eligible for the same rights an American prisoner would get, right? And
Oh
those
yeah.
rights aren't being upheld. And that is important, not because I care about these people. It's important because I believe in the idea of, when I was in the army, this is a big thing, that we should be held to higher standards, and we are not upholding that higher standard specifically with Guantanamo.
Oh yeah, and I mean, all of our arguments, I think, at least, like from a libertarian bend, come down to, like what we allow our government to do to anybody is something that we're potentially allowing our government to do to us someday. God forbid at some point, after years of allowing, this type of behavior and, some of the abhorrent abuses that have occurred there. Let's say some hypothetical president, we'll call him Schmobama, allows an airstrike on, say, a U.S. citizen without trial at some point.
Oh, are you
Like
implying that
things
might have happened?
things like this
Yes.
are possible. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm with Zach. I mean, Zach and I are we're probably two ends of the political spectrum as far as certain ideology, but I believe in procedure too. I mean, you can't claim to be this beacon of democracy in the world and then ignore, these ideas of fair trial. And as long as Guantanamo is open, and as long as people like Sheikh Mohammed hasn't had his day in court, there's not going to we basically just laugh at our own ideals, and that's just not acceptable.
Yeah, and the thing that's really frustrating with Guantanamo, on top of all of that stuff, is we've had this recurring theme in a lot of what we're talking about regarding Afghanistan. This is a more broad war on terror topic, but it still applies. One of the big problems was just lack of efficiency or lack of competency. There have been, what, 780 detainees go through Gitmo, and there's 40 there now. And as far as I know, of that 780, I think Abu Zubaydah is the only one who's ever been tried and convicted. Almost everybody else was released. They were either released back to their home country, or more often they went to a third party. Like Ireland's got a couple detainees were released there, Greece, like just random countries. And this will tie into what we'll get into later on. But when we talk about Gitmo serving as a recruiting tool, if a lot of these people, they were picked up in the middle of the night, whether they're in Afghanistan or Yemen or North Africa, sent off to this detention center across the world, potentially tortured, certainly abused for some of them upwards of 10, 15 years, and then just let go. It's like, hey, no hard feelings, right? Well, no, now you've got a problem, because that person who was probably indifferent to the overall military war on terror now has a side in that fight.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you basically created your own terrorist training ground. Whether you meant to do that, we could argue that. No, but whether you meant to do it or not, you've Gitmo, basically anybody that has been released from Gitmo, especially that's returned to Afghanistan, certainly would harbor massive resentment, like you said, where they may have not cared whatsoever prior to being there.
I think they said somewhere between 25 and 30% of Gitmo detainees that have been released. So 25 to 30% out of 740 people. So anywhere from, what, 170 to 220 have returned to the battlefield if they were not already on the battlefield.
That's insane. I mean, I wonder how they got that data.
I'm not sure. I know
Well,
most of those.
yeah, what a question,
I
right?
know. I know that's a tough one. Most of the, I think the majority of that 25 to 30% were released, I believe, under the Bush administration, and then like 5 or 6% was released under the Obama administration.
I thought Obama, and so from what I saw, Obama inherited like around 500 and dropped it down to 40.
I think it was 41. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It was 40 or 41 when he left. It was 41, and then one was released under the Trump administration, which goes counter to what
Woo.
he said he was going to do.
Yeah.
Um,
He wasn't a
nine,
bad enough dude.
yeah,
No.
9 people have died in detention. So yeah, the number now is 40, and now the big issue. So yeah, I saw that President Biden says he wants to close Gitmo, which again, I think we're all in agreement with, or we all support that idea. The issue now is you're going to have a Congress. Now we're going to get a little current. A Congress that doesn't want to do that because for some reason, like we said earlier, they don't. They what's so fucking difficult about moving them to a military prison stateside? And or we can do this. Here's a better option. How about we just fucking charge them and send them to trial?
Yeah.
Because that's the thing that's pissed me off the most. Is like, could you imagine? You know, if you, I live in Southeast Idaho. Like, if I got rolled up one day by the Bannock County Sheriff's Department and I just sat in the jail for 10 years, like there would be a riot. There would be potential uprisings if that happened in America.
By principle, absolutely. No. I mean, it's a huge issue. Like, if we're gonna establish these rules for how people should be treated and how prisoners, I mean, they're essentially prisoners of war, and the fact that we've you know
Yes.
the fact that for years, for decades even, we allowed like criminal abuse, because people, I think, got in a lot of trouble over the treatment of detainees over in Gitmo. I remember my I, I think pretty much every deployment, as soon as you get into country, the chaplain or JAG pulls you over and they're like, "Hey, don't abuse prisoners, Gitmo and all that. All right, go ahead and go
Right.
and
on." Like,
and you shouldn't need that, right?
yeah,
And it's I remember reading somewhere. It was back when I was an analyst in the army. I was like a specialist, and I was reading somewhere that this great idea about how to treat your adversary. I was getting ready to go to Iraq, and it was you know something along the lines of how you treat your enemies speaks more to your character than how you treat your friends. And I agree. That kind of goes back to what Stu is saying. What they would do to somebody they don't like is still an example of what they may potentially one day do to you. And we treated these people like utter shit. Word got out, and groups like ISIS or ISIL, like they have a month. Well, I don't know if they still do, but when I was in, they had a monthly magazine that came out in English, and we
yeah,
were able to get a digital copy for work reasons, obviously. And we're sitting here looking at it, and they're talking about Guantanamo, and this is 2014, 2015, and
mhm,
they're still they're using this as justification for what they're doing. Like, it went from the U.S. is occupying these Islamic lands, which is technically true. We are stationed in places like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Jordan. So that's not incorrect, even if they are um, presenting it with a slant, right? That's true, but at the same time, there's all this proof and evidence that one, we're holding people without actually trying them, which is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. And whether we like the Geneva Convention or not, we have signed on and agreed to uphold them and abide by them. Okay, there's that. There's not being tried. There's the torture. Like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded what 200 and something times, and it amounted to nothing. But we got Bin Laden, so they said, well, clearly waterboarding works.
Yeah, and if you want to talk about some of the stuff that people endured, I've pulled up a page here that has some lovely descriptions. If you guys want to know, many of the
Sure.
released prisoners have complained of enduring beatings, sleep deprivation, prolonged constraint in uncomfortable positions, prolonged hooding, cultural and sexual humiliation, enemas, as well as other forced injections, other physical and psychological mistreatment. As a matter of fact, there's a story of a U.S. Army specialist, Sean Baker, who was ordered in a training exercise at Gitmo, and he was directed to play the role of a prisoner. Okay, and they had to wear the orange jumpsuit and everything. Army does training all the time, like where you dress up and you go out or whatever and do this. Well, he was beaten so bad that he suffered a brain injury and seizures from then on out and discharged. That's a U.S. Army specialist. What else? Other guys were having water poured over him, interrogations at midnight lasting 12 hours, military dogs being used to intimidate, people shaved, which is an insult to people, to certain Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's just humiliation. And whether these people
Yeah,
did
there.
anything or not is irrelevant. Really, we just don't treat people like that.
Yeah. There was a 2015 article from the Guardian saying that the CIA used sexual abuse as well as other forms of torture. Detainee Majid Khan said that interrogators poured ice water on his genitals, twice videotaped him naked, and repeatedly touched his private parts. Like just crazy stuff that you wouldn't expect from what's supposed to be the greatest bastion of justice in the world.
Well, and that speaks to like, capability wise. Yeah, I would say it's pretty clear cut. We are the best when it comes to that. But there's I'm not going to say there's a lot lacking, but we have always been lacking in certain parts of our professionalism, whether it's Gitmo or whether it's hearing about, you know, there was that army unit that was like cutting off body parts of like dead.
Yeah,
I don't know if it was in Iraq or Afghanistan, but dead insurgents.
yeah,
And like one of the privates, like, oh, I was just doing what my sergeant told me to do. It's like, no, you got to fucking know better, dude. You know you can't do that. And then you have people, well, yeah, they pissed on their bodies because they were shooting at them. It's like, yeah, because we're shooting at them. That's how war works. Treat your enemy with respect. That's why I take serious issue with Eddie Gallagher, right? And that whole fiasco, to which he just came out like a month ago and basically fucking admitted that he killed that guy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not only that too. I think the more concerning, the humans are capable of nasty stuff. We are. I mean, look at even U.S. servicemen in Vietnam. You get the My Lai massacre, stuff like that. This stuff happens, and it's always disturbing when you find out how much oversight and how far up the chain of command at Gitmo and even in country, that this stuff has to go. And people are like, this is okay. Like, how far up does it go where they're just like, at what point does like that specialist or that sergeant or that captain, or, I mean, at what point nobody stops it? Because I mean, they all know what's going on, they have to. And it's like, that's the disturbing part to me about the Gitmo torture and everything is like, nah, that's fine. And they will gladly carry it out. And they gladly did for years.
Yep. We have spent close to $10 billion keeping people detained at Gitmo, and all we have gotten out of it is more heartburn because we have created exponentially more adversaries than the 788 people that have gone through that facility. All right, so part one, we talked a lot about, almost entirely about just the practices at Guantanamo and how that would resonate to the outside world, especially Muslims who are in those countries like Pakistan and Yemen and Afghanistan, and how they can look at the images and hear about their fellow Muslims being detained for extended periods of time without trial, and how that is in direct conflict with America's ideals. So now we're going to transition, excuse me, a little more into the detention practices in Afghanistan, and specifically the detention practices early in Afghanistan, because as time went on, they did improve to the point that, Stu, when we were there, as far as we know, the detention procedure was pretty straightforward. They'd go out on a patrol, they might roll up a guy or two, come, bring them in, question them, and then go from there. If they were affiliated with the Taliban or any other regional group in southern Afghanistan, they probably get handed over to the Afghans for further detention. Otherwise, they were let go. But that's definitely not how it was going on at the beginning of the conflict.
by the time we got there in like my first deployment in 2012, Jag had pretty clearly laid down the rules, and at the very least the threat of Leavenworth was enough to keep people very procedural and following the rules pretty closely. So
Yeah.
that was something, but there was definitely a journey to get there.
Yeah. So when we first started our involvement in Afghanistan, you really started at Bagram Airfield, right? It was the largest, I believe, it's the largest base in Afghanistan, right? Old Soviet built installation, and that's where our base of operations has been really for the past 20 years. And there is an old, I think it was a Soviet mechanic shop that we converted into a detention facility, not a prison. There is a difference. So we make a good. We try to not call them prisons because they're not prisons; they're detention facilities. And it was at this facility in Bagram where you really see the the lack of professionalism that we talked about in the first part, and you see that lack of understanding of how to do a job and what happens when you give soldiers carte blanche to operate without any true guidance. And a great documentary I watched the other day is called Taxi to the Dark Side, and it's about the detention programs in Afghanistan for the most part in Bagram, but they also talk about Kabul. And the first individual they talk about is a young man named Dilawar, who I believe was in his early 20s. He was rolled up in late November of 2002, right? So this is in that first couple years. And he had been accused of being the getaway driver for a group of Taliban fighters who had launched a rocket at Bagram. Well, it turns out what had happened is that he was a taxi driver. He picked up a fare of three guys, and somebody found an electronic device in the back of his car, the back of his taxi, and they pretty much accused him of being the getaway driver for the Taliban, being a facilitator. Right? When we talk about facilitation, that's one of the many ways somebody might be classified as a facilitator, and that brought up a whole nother issue, that terminology. And all it takes to be a facilitator is if you drive somebody from point A to point B, now you're on a watch list somewhere. So he got rolled up, and he ended up dying in less than a month, uh, because he shows up. You've got a military intelligence unit and an MP unit working hand in hand. One group is questioning, the other group is serving as military police. They're supposed to be the ones running the actual detention facility. And for Dilawar, they're talking about the area in which he was confined, and it was like about an 8 foot by 10 foot room, and the top was just like a metal grated roof that allowed them to handcuff him to the top. And their preferred form of punishment, either to get him to talk or just for entertainment, was to hit him above his knee on either side, where you've got a pressure point, which would cause him to drop and put all the weight on his wrists. Dilawar ended up dying at 2 o'clock in the morning one day, and when the coroner looked at when they did the autopsy, his legs had been pulpified. They estimated he'd been hit above the knee over 100 times in the matter of an hour or two. It basically lost the ability to push that blood throughout his body. And it was after that that they found out he had nothing to do with any Taliban activity. And the officer that ran this facility, she got promoted to captain, and her next assignment was to run the detention facility at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, and we all know how that one turned out.
Yeah, that's that's one of the most natural things to occur in the military is, someone screws up at a lower echelon and they end up getting pushed up to a higher echelon, and this oftentimes with officers, unfortunately, you see promotions coming out of it as well. Just
Yeah, and
it's
so
it's a way to push a problem, away from the front line, so at least like the lower level soldiers don't have to deal with it. But in this case, it led to numerous human rights abuses
absolutely,
and
and
deaths.
this place in Bagram is one of the places where Afghans, or really just any fighters in Afghanistan, right? They weren't all Afghans, but these fighters were sent their like initial holding facility until they would go to Guantanamo. And there's examples of a guy named Moazzam Beg, who was he's a British citizen of Pakistani descent, and he had moved to Afghanistan prior, I believe it said prior to 9/11. And to the best of my understanding, reading up on his background, he was looking for an Islamic country to live in. There was nothing in his profile that suggested he was an extremist of any sort. He ends up getting arrested, sent to Guantanamo for 3 years, and then the British government finally got him out. luckily, his family didn't turn into a bunch of insurgents. And the same with like reading up about Dilawar, they talked to his brother, and the best I can tell, they're pissed at America, right? But they didn't take up arms. And the problem is that's probably a minority, right? We talked about the in the Abdul Razak episode about how he was probably creating enemies when he would go around and just roll up people from the Norzai tribe. Like this is that same concept, right? We have people like Gulag Ashurzai, the power broker in southern Afghanistan, when we first show up, telling us, "Yeah, that guy's a Taliban driver," or "That guy's a bomb expert," and really they're just business rivals. And so we arrest them, send them to these detention facilities, have very little supervision, and then some of them eventually made it to Guantanamo. And that's not exactly the best way to go about doing stuff. And the frustrating thing is, in hindsight, the failures are so glaringly obvious. Where a lot of these soldiers who were involved, especially at the Bagram detention facility, were acquitted of all the charges, right? And then it was a big list of soldiers who were tried for various issues, and a lot of them got off on the technicality that there wasn't really a whole lot of direction on how they were supposed to be doing their job.
And I mean, you thought we established, at least back as far as the end of World War II, that following, what you believe to be an illegal order is, allowed for a soldier. But so many of them, just willingly went out and started, conducting these horrific human abuses, without any question. I mean, shoot, you were saying in the documentary you were watching that some of the guys were like, yeah, yeah, it's the job, it's whatever, committing these horrific abuses against, some people, which I'm sure were probably involved in terrorist activity. And I don't really care about what happens to them as a person, but as far as like as a freedom loving individual who doesn't want his own country to commit human rights abuses that eventually could be turned back on you or I'd obviously be opposed to this.
Right. I mean, we're opposed to it, right, from that human decency standpoint. But even then,
Yeah.
from a counterinsurgency standpoint, you
Right.
have to understand that you run the risk when you go to a house in a village and you roll up everybody in there. There's a good chance you might roll up somebody who has nothing to do with what's going on. You need to treat these detainees not with respect, right, but with decency. Okay, and time after time after time, we have seen that you get more answers by just talking to these detainees than you do beating the hell out of them. Like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who, by the way, in part one I said it was a civilian trial. It's a military commission, best I could tell. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded 183 times, and he confessed to everything under the sun. Well, no shit, he did. He was being waterboarded, which is torture. Just anybody who is
Yeah.
curious, waterboarding is absolutely torture. Okay, he's waterboarded almost 200 times, and the big lie, and not the current big lie, but the big lie in this sense that was getting passed along was that is what led us to capturing Osama bin Laden. When the CIA's or when the torture report about the CIA's torture practices showed that none of that had anything to do with Osama bin Laden's capture. It was all on information that was obtained without torture, right? So we have proof there just from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that if you just talk to them, you'll get information. And we see that over and over and over throughout the 20 years we've been in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, at the beginning of this, then none of that existed. And that just created more issues for the boots on the ground. And Stu, like you said, you're a freedom loving American. I am too. And then there's also those who would call themselves freedom loving Americans who I don't think are very supportive of freedom, who would look at what we were doing in Afghanistan regarding how we were treating detainees and saying, well, we didn't go far enough. Like, no, we went too far. And the reason why we kept getting shot at is because we went too far.
Yeah, I mean, it's all you have to understand that every single person that you bring in a country like Afghanistan has a very close knit family, and not just immediate family. You're talking cousins and uncles and nephews and extended family that will start firing at your brothers and sisters if you start torturing their family members. Especially, and it's bad enough if it is an actual Taliban member or terrorist that you have, but if it's some random schmuck in a taxi, some random taxi driver that you end up taking and beating to death, that there's no faster way to turn people fanatical than to start abusing and killing their family members.
Absolutely. And when you look at Americans who have gone overseas, when you look at individuals like Jihad Mustafa and Omar Hamami, who both went to fight with Al Shabaab, they were the first two American Islamic militants I ever covered as an analyst. Right? They're in Somalia, and I didn't cover anything before when they left the states because of Patriot Act reasons. Right? But one of the reasons why they did it, they were both raised in the Islamic faith, and they were angry with how the U.S. was treating Muslims in areas that we would all consider Muslim lands, like the Gulf states, the Middle East, Central Asia. You know, this was all after the torture reports and stuff were coming out. They got pissed off enough that they left and went to help fight in other parts of the world, right? So this had adverse effects far beyond just the walls of Afghanistan or Iraq, right? But I find it absolutely amazing that I think her name was Carolyn Wood. She was the lieutenant who was in charge of that Bagram detention facility, was promoted to captain, and then she was in charge of Abu Ghraib. And then we've all seen the pictures. Like, it was just as bad, if not worse. I mean, they're on top of the torture. They're covering these detainees in piss and shit and pretending to electrocute them. Just like none of that was done to get answers, right? And the most frustrating thing, if you watch this documentary, they talk to a general who used to be the commander at Guantanamo, and his whole thing is, I'm doing this to help keep American lives safe. Yeah, but none of what we did helped keep American lives safe. All it did is endanger them even more.
Yeah, I mean, how many soldiers lost their lives because of these things? And I mean, it's under the frustrations at the like. I don't want us to look at this with like rose tinted, the hindsight is 2020 glasses. Like, yeah, the horrors of 9/11 were very real, and the thousands that lost their lives both during the attack and afterward, those heroes that got sick afterward. And it's an absolutely terrible thing, but you're not you're not going to make anything better by conducting human torture. And you lose your moral ground to stand on if you conduct torture. That's the bottom line.
And people will use war to try to justify anything. And like, well, does that mean we still need to act a certain way? Yes, it absolutely does. Right. And
Yeah.
we we just had a president who was very much a proponent of that American exceptionalism. And I'll leave that to the audience to interpret whatever their version of American exceptionalism is. My version of American exceptionalism is you stand by your principles, right? And what happened in the early parts of the war regarding the detention and interrogation programs was not us standing up beside our principles.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're a country built on principles. It's the very foundation upon which this nation was formed. And if you're looking at the horrific war crimes that we from nations that we fought against, like the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy, the horrific war crimes that they conducted against prisoners of war. I mean, are we trying to emulate, some of our greatest enemies? Like, at some point, you have to look at things and say, America is going to be, the bastion of hope and liberty and human rights that we've set out to be, and we absolutely have to stand by those principles. Otherwise, we're left with nothing. And the as um, the politics of the world develop, God forbid we end up in a war with a state that doesn't respect those principles, like say China, or some other world power leaping forward that we end up fighting, and you end up having U.S. troops or U.S. civilians under capture by a foreign power. I mean, what do you do then? Like establishing the way that we're willing to treat prisoners now could affect things for decades on, because remember, in the area that we've had most of our conflicts over the last 20 years, they have very long memories. People especially in the Middle East have incredibly long memories. I mean, there's people in Iran who have issues, going back, hundreds or thousands of years with enemies in the area. And so
Well, I
it's
mean, yeah,
something that you definitely have to consider.
one of the reasons that we operate out of Kuwait, it's been 30 years now, but they see us as we came in and we helped them when Saddam invaded in what 90 91. So yeah, I mean they have very long memories out there, and it's not going to change anytime soon, right? So that's a very broad overlay of the detention program at the early stages of the war in Afghanistan. And the big three things was there was a lack of a direction, there was a lack of professionalism, and at the end of the day, there was a lack of accountability. One person was penalized, I'd say, or punished relatively harshly. He got a 5 month prison sentence and a reduction in grade. Everybody else was pretty much cleared of charges because there was no guidance to warrant being found guilty of dereliction of duty. But beyond that, and we talked about it a little bit in the first part, and it's probably the most famous element of this whole topic is that CIA torture report that the Senate Intelligence Committee released in, I believe it was 2006. And really, was it 2006? May have been a little later. 2012. Um, that really starts in Kabul, Afghanistan, at a place that was referred to as Cobalt or the Salt Pit. And basically, the CIA torture program was a series of uh, interrogation methods created by two psychologists who used to work in the special forces program. They worked specifically with the SEER guys, which that's your was it survival, evasion, risk and escape
Resistance and escape.
resistance
Yeah.
and escape. Sorry, basically, if you're captured, if you fall behind enemy lines, it's the school that's supposed to teach you how to survive. And there were psychologists that worked with that school. Their names are Bruce Jessen and James Mitchell. Um, both had PhDs in psychology. I believe both were veterans. I know one of them, I think it was Mitchell, was in the Air Force, and Jessen may have been a Marine. Uh, it turns out that neither of them had a working understanding of Al Qaeda, and neither of them were certified or qualified to be interrogators. Right, the whole purpose of their program, that they were given a $180 million contract by the CIA to implicate. Is implicate the right word?
Implement.
Implement. There we go. Implement, implicate. It's all the same with the CIA. The they were given $180 million to implement this program and oversee the intelligence collection. Right, because at the end of the day, all these detentions, the whole point is intelligence collection more than anything else. It's not about eventually getting these guys to a trial. It's you roll somebody up. What do you know about what's going on in this area? Who's the Taliban commander? And tacti pool, and you go from there. And if they don't have anything, in theory, you should let them go. Right? Well, Bruce Jessen and James Mitchell had a completely different way of looking at it. They created this compound referred to as, like I said, cobalt or the salt pit, and from there it got really really ugly. A lot of these uh, detainees who were eventually sent to Guantanamo spent upwards of a year in this area outside of Kabul. like it looked like an abandoned building. I guess it was an old salt mine, right? Which is why they call it the salt pit. And you know, eventually, some of these tactics carried over to Guantanamo. They were they were utilized in black sites throughout the world, specifically in Poland. And like the president of Poland at the time that this report came out said that, oh, we told the U.S. that we wouldn't allow them to operate in Poland if they kept doing this, which I don't buy for a second. I think that's the Polish government trying to cover their ass. But this was all originally done in Afghanistan, and one of the big justifications for a lot of this was that it wasn't happening on U.S. soil, right? And that was the thing about Guantanamo. They're saying, well, it's not U.S. soil. Well, technically they're right because we're only leasing the installation. We don't own it. We owned some of these military bases out in like Germany until if we ever leave, then we won't own them anymore. But we outright own them. Like I was born in Germany on an American military installation, so I was technically born in American soil, right? That's how that works. So a place like Afghanistan, they use loopholes such as, well, it's not America, so we're not, we don't need to abide by the Geneva Conventions, and that's where things like just beating these detainees to the point that they would pass out, shackling them to cold walls, putting them in stress positions for extended periods of time, making them wear diapers and defecate, making them urinate all over themselves. That's where all this came from.
Honey potting some of them in some cases,
Yeah,
really crazy, like the craziest like stuff that you imagine the CIA does. I mean, it probably has happened in one of these sites.
yeah, and some of these guys, the CIA just once they detained them, they didn't even try to figure out what's the best way to extract information. They just go straight into torture, right? Ice baths, forced enemas, things like that. And there were 20 key findings when the CIA report came out, or when the Senate Intelligence Committee report came out. And the first one, the CIA's use of enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation. No shit. Like, obviously not, because like we've said, if you're being tortured, you'll probably say whatever it takes to stop being tortured. If somebody's got a blowtorch to my kneecap, I'll talk really fucking quick because I value my kneecaps more than I value some lie I can tell you to stop torturing me. And they look at the CIA's justification for its uses were based on inaccurate claims, which is true. Every CIA director under the program said that this wasn't happening. Michael Hayden, who I hate because he endorsed the Patriot Act, he's a huge proponent of the Patriot Act. Very famously saying, "Oh yeah, we don't torture people. That doesn't happen in the CIA." Like, yeah, it does, and you authorize it. There's a brief to Donald Rumsfeld, and he's the Secretary of Defense, where they're talking about forcing detainees to stand for 8 hours at a time, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you take into account the conditions, it's awful. And his response was, yeah, they make him stand for 4 hours at a time, and his response was, "Well, I stand for up to 8 hours a day. Why can't they?"
I've been in enough chain of commands to know that having people stand for a certain amount of hours is definitely cause. I've seen enough 21-year-old privates fall out to know that that's an issue.
Oh, I hate change of command ceremonies.
Oh, they're
There
awful.
was one. Oh, I only ever had to do like one or two. I got to miss out when Joe Biden was vice president. He came to talk, and luckily I was on some bullshit like landscaping duty, so I didn't have to go to that.
Nice.
I went to IHOP instead, and they're like just sweating their asses off on Fort Bragg. Not this guy. Right?
See, I was in an SF unit, so luckily
Yeah.
they didn't.
You barely wore a uniform
too
then.
many of us.
Yeah. And the crazy thing with this program is that there are reports at the end of 2003 that it's not effective, it's not working, that these two contractors that the CIA has hired, they're frauds. Like they're just at this point a couple of masochists who are, basically the equivalent of getting their rocks off by watching these people suffer. And that's really what it came down to at the end of the day. This was people that wanted to inflict pain for no reason other than inflicting pain. Right? So when we talk about in the first part how we're proceduralist and hear about how principle and morals matter, this is why that shit matters, because now we're the country that has on the Statue of Liberty, give us you're tired, you're weak, you're poor, you're huddled masses. I know I got that out of order, but it says that. And no, we're not that. Now we're the guys that if you look funny or if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time in downtown Baghdad, we're going to roll you up and we're going to electrocute you on and off for 5 days, make you stand in a pile of your own shit and starve you for a week at a time.
Yeah.
And that guy's family is going to go and grab a 122 or a 107 and try to chuck it at Camp Victory, which they did several times.
Yeah. Yeah. Because somebody within like 500 kilometers of you planned, the worst attack against American soil in 80 years and possibly ever. Like
Yeah,
that has something to do with you. Like
some of the lessons learned from the cigar, especially discussing the early part of the war, they're talking about just that lack of cultural understanding and that lack of establishing good contacts in the country and not relying on the warlords when we first got there, which is what we did. Like the first person we talked to in northern Afghanistan is Abdul Dostum, who,
God.
I mean, on the whole, I guess he leans more towards good guy, but he's in it for himself just like everybody else. But these are the people that we were leaning on, and we didn't take any time to learn anything about the Afghans. And
Yeah.
it has cost us so much here on the back end because now we're trying to make up for all the shit we did in the first half.
Yeah, if you've seen that movie, what was it, 12 Strong?
Yeah.
Dostum is the main Afghan contact that the guys are working for there. The next time you watch that movie, remember that Dostum was I don't know, he was accused. I don't know if he was like formally charged with, but sexually assaulting someone with an AK-47. So
Yeah.
that's the kind of guy that we stuck with at the beginning of
Yeah,
the war.
that's who we aligned ourselves with, and everybody out in that country understands who these warlords are, and that went just as far as any gestures we ever made towards them.
Yeah. So I have here in front of me a statement for the record from Major General Michael R. Leonard, USMC retired. He was the general in charge of Gitmo back in, I think, September to or it was like early 2002, I think. And he was basically sent to go and build the first cells over in Gitmo when we started using it as a prison camp. And he had a few reasons for us shutting down Guantanamo. The so I'm just gonna pull a few things from his statement. So why should we close Guantanamo? First and foremost, because Guantanamo's continued existence hurts our prosecution in the fight against terrorists. It feeds into the narrative that the United States is not a nation of laws nor one that respects human rights. Secondly, Guantanamo's extra legal status is inconsistent with our values as Americans.
Yep, 2 for 2.
And thirdly, Guantanamo and all locations where so-called enhanced interrogation techniques were practiced are a blight on our honor, and put our citizens at greater risk. It's not an accident that many captives executed by terrorists were filmed being killed wearing orange jumpsuits. We're feeding the terrorist narrative by creating our own. Torture and its euphemism, enhanced interrogation techniques, don't make us safer. They don't deliver useful intelligence, and these practices are beneath us. When Senator McCain stood on the floor, we could talk about McCain for a while, of the Senate on December 9th, 2014, and delivered his opposition to torture, it was his finest hour in a lifetime of service.
I
Despite
agree.
significant pushback from many in his own party, he's the one elected member of our government with absolute credibility on this topic. Torture is wrong. It's also ineffective. Guantanamo is a symbol of a flawed, ill-considered, and shameful policy. It must be closed.
I think I completely agree with that. John McCain was a mediocre senator at best, but holy shit, that was his finest hour. And I remember
Oh
watching
yeah.
that, and I thought, yeah, absolutely. And who, like the general
Who
says in
who
that letter,
better
who
after what
better?
he went through? Yeah.
Exactly. Who better to talk about that than the guy who actually experienced it? And then, by contrast, my last couple months in Afghanistan, this is 2017, right? This is November. So we are in year 17 of this war. And I'm working with the South Carolina Reserves. And he's a sergeant or a staff sergeant that's in the intel shop with me. And I don't know why he thought it was a good idea to talk to me about counterinsurgency, but his whole thing was, we just need to kill everybody out here. And I go, where the fuck have you been the last 16 years, dude? Because
We tried. Jeez.
yeah, one, we tried that. Two, the intel field, which he is a part of, has been saying for over a decade at this point that that's not how this works. You cannot shoot an ideology in the face, right? It's just a concept that's so foreign to so many people. And the thing is, it shouldn't have been foreign to him because he's involved with it. Yeah, he's a reservist, so he didn't do it full time like you and I, but he did the job, and he should understand that you can't just go around bomb an entire country into oblivion and say you won, because now all you did is piss off all the Muslims in Pakistan. Okay, we can kill everybody in Pakistan. Now you piss off all the Muslims in Iran, even though they're Shia, or all the Muslims in Saudi Arabia. Like the war does not and never worked that way, and too many people who are calling the shots and running the show think that it did, and
Yeah.
that has led to so much more bloodshed on both sides.
Well, I think I man, shoot, I think it it goes all the way back to World War II. I think we developed a lot of misconceptions over nation building because two nations surrendered to us, and then we were able to develop them into modern democracies. But I mean
Yeah,
that
but I
it
mean,
hasn't. Where has it worked since?
Germany was already pretty modern. Even Japan, despite being an Eastern nation, was pretty modern. Right. This is, and that's a great topic that we're going to get into eventually about trying to create Western democracy in a country that wants nothing to do with Western democracy. All right, so that's going to wrap up episode 7. Thanks everybody for listening to us at this to this point. You may have noticed Kyle was not in this second part. This second part's actually recorded 2 days after the first part because I forgot to hit the record button. So Kyle's off. He got called into work because we have jobs outside of this. But uh, thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. We got another guest, a buddy of ours from our time down in Kandahar, who I think that'll be a very interesting conversation because he brings a lot of different perspectives. He was kind of a jack of all trades down there. He worked several different jobs, and there's a whole lot of different ways we can go with next week's episode. And we're also going to start looking at getting more involved on social media. We want to eventually do like a live Q&A on YouTube or something like that. So if you have any ideas, anything that you want us to talk about, or a good day or time to do it, please let us know on our Instagram page, which is at the Boardwalk Podcast. Thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.